I'm very pleased to present to you Michael Heinrich. Michael Heinrich is a German Marxist theoretician and a scholar of Marx. He is a professor at the Hochschule für Technik und Ökonomie in Berlin and the managing editor of Journal of Critical Social Sciences, Prokla. Besides Hans-Georg Backhaus and Helmut Reichelt, he is one of the leading representatives of the current called the Neue Marx-Lektüre, or the New Reading of Marx. He has written several books on Marx theory of value and other topics from the field of critique of political economy. He's an author of a book called the Wissenschaft von Wert, or the science of value, about to be translated into English till the end of this year by Alexander Locascio. If I'm not mistaken, he's also an author of a more popular but no less lucid book, An Introduction to the 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital, that has recently been also translated into Slovenian by Mojca Dobnikar and published by the Slovenian publishing house Sofia. So you mustn't forget to buy this book after the interview. So today's event, as I already mentioned, will take place in the form of an interview, discussion between the two of us, and will be followed by a questions and answer session for the public. So the interview will roughly consist of 3 parts. So first we will discuss some of the questions concerning the general understanding and reception of Marx theory. We will proceed with a more detailed discussion on Marx's theory of value, and finish with a talk on some Marxist theories of crisis. So let's go to the first part. So to label this dominant orthodox current of Marxist thought present in the works of the most famous Marxist theoreticians such as Engels, Kautsky, and Lenin, you coined the term Weltanschauungsmarxismus, or worldview Marxism. So my first question would be, what is worldview Marxism, and what is the prevalent perception of Marx economic theory within worldview Marxism?
Okay. First, thank you very much for the invitation to come here, and also thanks to the translator and the publishing house that you did all the work with my book to translate it and to distribute it. Now, your first question about worldview Marxism. When we look to the work of Marx, when we look to Capital, it is a scientific analysis with certain political intentions. What I call worldview Marxism is much more. It tries to give a broad orientation in the world, a system which provides you with answers to nearly everything, and which is not anymore scientific. Maybe it has some scientific parts, but as a whole it is not really scientific. It is more something like a worldly religion. And this thing, it was not coined, it emerged not by purpose, that someone said, oh, we want to have something. It emerged step by step in the old German Social Democratic Party. Engels, you mentioned 3 names, Engels, Kautsky and Lenin. I would make big differences between these names. Engels, I would say he is not really a representative of this Weltanschauungsmarxismus, this worldview Marxism, but in order to defend Marxian ideas against a lot of attacks, he was forced to say something about philosophy, about natural sciences, and so on. And later, others, beginning with Kautsky, formed from this part something like such a worldly religion. This was strengthened by Lenin. There is one sentence also quoted in my book, which makes this very clear, where he says, Marxism is almighty because it is true. This has nothing to do with scientific critique in the tradition of Marx. And this what was already prepared by Lenin. Then after Lenin, when Marxism, Leninism was created and became also a moment of justification of Stalinism, then this worldview Marxism was ready.
Okay, so we could say that this Weltanschauung Marxismus was prevalent till the first part of the 20th century, but later on, in the 60s or 70s, new unorthodox approaches to Marx theory emerged, particularly, say, Althusser's structural reading of Capital in France, or the operaismo current in Italy, and of course, the Neue Marx-Lektüre, initiated by the works of Backhaus and Reichelt. My question would be, basically, since you belong to this latter current of the Neue Marx-Lektüre, what were the main contributions of the Neue Marx-Lektüre to the break with this worldview Marxism?
Okay, at first also we have to be a little bit cautious with this term, Neue Marx-Lektüre, new reading of Marx. It was not used for a school with common features, common beliefs or whatever. It just should say that in many countries in the 60s, a new reading started with very different results. You mentioned already Althusser. In a broad sense, you can say all this is the new reading of Marx in Germany. Especially it is connected to the names of Backhaus and Althusser. And there are the points that it is concentrated on Marx's critique of political economy. In other countries or other thinkers, they are focused more to philosophical issues, but here it was the critique of political economy. And it had two very important new moments. The first moment was really to recognize, or to make the attempt fully to recognize what it means that Capital, the 3 volumes of Marx Capital, are incomplete. They are very incomplete. We cannot say it is a coherent theory. And secondly, to recognize that Marxian theory, and not only the whole theory, also the critique of political economy, shows a certain development from Grundrisse, written in 1857-58, to Capital, and the last manuscripts of Capital were written in 79 to 1881. So the process of emerging of these 3 volumes of Capital lasted 20 years, and it also provided differences. It is not always the same. So the one point was to say it is incomplete. There are unsolved problems. We cannot find to every question and answer in Capital. The second point was to say there is a kind of development. We have really to look on different texts as representatives of different periods of Marx's research process, and it is not easy to combine what Marx wrote in Grundrisse 57 and what he wrote in a manuscript for the 2nd volume of Capital from 1875. And this new approach was supported by, you can say, a historical accident. In 1800, I'm still in 19th century, in 1975, in East Berlin started the new Mega, the new Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe. The first started already in the 1920s. Now this new Mega started, and it provided much more manuscripts because there was a lot of things unpublished, even in this year 1975, and also published manuscripts in a quite different quality, because in the old editors, starting with Engels, they didn't present really the original manuscript. They did some work on it. They tried to construct a ready-made work, for example, German ideology, but also volume 2 and 3 of Capital. And now with Mega, for the first time, we have the chance to read the original without any changes, and we see there are really differences. And so we had, especially in Germany, in this Neue Marx-Lektüre, a new approach, how we want to treat the texts. And on the other hand, we have a new chance to get new texts, and texts in a much better editorial quality.
A lot of new readers of Marx also emphasized the peculiarity of Marx thought in terms of its difference to the tradition of the classical political economy. So, because often this continuation of thought from the classical political economy, such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo, to Marx was seen as a straight line of progression. So you have also tackled this view. So you mentioned, basically emphasized Marx's scientific revolution, consisting of a radical break between the classical political economy on the one hand and Marx's critique of political economy on the other. So how do you conceptualize this scientific revolution?
Okay, first, you mentioned the continuation, which many writers see. There is the idea that Marx is in the tradition of the classics, but he himself saw him as a critic of the classics. The subtitle of Capital is Critique of Political Economy, and not a new approach or a new theory of political economy. This was overseen in history because at the end of the 19th century, in mainstream economics, there was a big change. The old classical school was abolished. The new, what was in favor now was the marginal utility theory, and very quickly we had a fight between such persons who said, when we speak about economy, we must stress labor and production, and these new guys who said we have to stress marginal utility, consumption, circulation, and so on. And in this new front line, Marx was put together with Smith and Ricardo in one camp, opposed to the utility camp. But there are a lot of differences about value theory. We will talk probably later, but there are also differences in the scientific approach. When we speak of a scientific revolution in the history of science, we mean not only that a new theory comes up, that a new approach emerges. This permanently happens, and okay, when you want to make a career at the university, you have to say, oh, I have a new approach for this and that. But this doesn't constitute a scientific revolution. About a scientific revolution we can speak when things, concepts are questioned which until now were taken for granted, were even taken so much for granted that it is not necessary to discuss about. And suddenly, what is the not discussable becomes the center of controversy. And this Marx really did, in that he criticized not only several theories of classical political economy, he criticized the whole approach. And I tried to fix this. You mentioned in the introduction my book, Die Wissenschaft vom Wert, The Science of Value. And there I tried to fix it in 4 lines, in 4 fields that Marx breaks with assumptions which were taken for granted in the classics. He breaks with the idea that there is a kind of human essence. In modern economics, it is the human who is always utility maximizer. There is not such a thing like a human essence from which you can understand human behavior, no matter if it is today or 1,000 years ago. He also breaks with individualism, what nowadays is called methodological individualism. You start with the individuum, and from this you construct social relations. Marx knows very well that individuals are always embedded in social relation. Marx breaks with empiricism. This is a difficult point. It doesn't mean that Marx was against empirical research or collecting empirical data. He was a forerunner of searching for empirical data, but he was very well aware that a scientific understanding of economy is much, much more than only to collect empirical data. That society and economy is not a transparent thing. You just have to look cautiously and you will see everything. No, there are mystifications, fetishism, and so on, which doesn't allow you, just by using empirical methods, to gain all information you need. And last but not least, the break was in the field of historicism. The mainstream economics until today is still an ahistorical science. They know that there is history, but they, for example, neoclassical history, neoclassical economics has a conception of economics that it is always the same problem with which we are confronted. We have limited means and infinite aims, and now we must, with our limited means, make a choice which of these infinite aims we will follow. And this is the same situation for the Neanderthal man 100,000 years ago and for a modern capitalist enterprise. This is meant with ahistoricism, that the basic structures are the same. And Marx makes a big break with this and says there are very different historical logics of society, of economy. And so, I think we can speak of a scientific revolution because all this, what was taken for granted in mainstream economics and also mainstream sociology, is put in question by Marx.
Okay, so this idea of scientific revolution definitely tackles this idea of a straight line of evolution of thought from classical political economy to Marxist critique of political economy, but I'm also interested in the evolution of Marx's own thought, because this progression from the young Marx of the economic and philosophical manuscripts to the later Marx of Capital is usually also seen in a somewhat similar teleological manner. Okay, say Althusser already tackled this idea. I mean, his idea of an epistemological break, separating the young idealistic Marx, supposedly tainted with this Feuerbachian and Hegelian ideology, and the mature scientific Marx is rather well known in Slovenia. So to what extent does your theory of Marx break also involve Marx break with his own past and moreover, how does your theory of the break differ from that of Althusser's notion of the epistemological break?
At first, before I come to the differences and also to the critique against Althusser, I have to highlight his merits. At the beginning, you mentioned these different approaches in the 60s and mentioned Backhaus, Reichelt and Neue Marx-Lektüre in Germany. They, in some respect, have the idea that there is no fundamental break in the development of Marx, and this was also my first ideas when I was occupied with Marx in my youth. And insofar, Althusser for me was a big encounter. I learned really that we can discuss things in a different way. And also this book, Wissenschaft vom Wert, is in some respect also influenced strongly by Althusser. Nevertheless, I have also a lot of critique against Althusser. To the point you mentioned, development of Marx, I have two main critics. Althusser has the idea that there is a main break, especially in the years 1845-46, when Marx wrote the thesis on Feuerbach and German ideology. And Althusser argues Marx here breaks with an ideological construction. It is the transition from ideology, which is the early Marx, the Marx of the Paris manuscripts, and he comes to science. And I question both theses of Althusser, that there is one main break. I can see much more than only one break, and a break in different fields. For example, what I mentioned before, these four dimensions in which Marx makes a difference to classical political economics, the break in these four dimensions didn't take place at the same time. There was a certain development. So there is, in my view, not only one break, there are several breaks, and secondly, there is not a break you can reduce to a break between ideology and science. This is a very misleading oversimplification. You have in Marx different approaches of science. You have different projects in the same approach to science. And this Marx is, when you occupy a little bit with his biography, with the development of his work, it is really fascinating what, I missed the word, machine. He was always reacting to new situations, new encounters with new theorists, and changing his own concepts. He let thousands of pages of manuscripts nearly ready in his desk because he was not longer satisfied. Nowadays, everybody who wrote 10 pages thinks he has to publish these 10 pages, otherwise the time is wasted. And this guy, he had thousands of pages, these very important things. not published. So, the idea of a break, that there is no continuation, I agree with Sarah, but the picture we need is much more complicated, much more detailed than Althusser provided us with. So Althusser is just, I would say now, the first to give some keywords to inspire, and still it is inspiring to read Lire le Capital, but it is not at all enough to cover all the problems and the issues we find in Marx.
Yes, since the time is running rather quickly, we have to skip to the part 2 of the interview, namely the theory of value, Marx's theory of value. So Marx's theory of value was obviously influenced by labor theory of value, even though there are differences, as you mentioned. But if you could just briefly, to start with, explain what is the basic notion behind the labor theory of value as developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo.
Yeah, this is an example for a simple question. You needed just 20 seconds to formulate it, but for a good answer I would need at least 1 hour. Because the problem is, there is not just that labor theory of value. You have in Adam Smith a rather complicated structure, how he treats labor and value. He gives labor as well as a measure of value, as well as a regulator of value. These are two very different things, but a lot of readers confuse it, and in some respect even Marx, I would say, confused in some points in theories of surplus value, confused these two aspects of Adam Smith. David Ricardo is not just the successor of Smith, which continues the story. I would say David Ricardo has a quite different story, and he is not a representative of labor theory in the full with the full meaning. His famous editor Piero Sraffa, who did an editing of Ricardo's works in the 1950s, he wrote a really ingenious introduction in this edition, and he showed that Ricardo had some from a labor theory of value, very different ideas. So already the notion of the classical labor theory of value is not so easy. It is not one simple, coherent theory. Marx himself, by the way, he never used the term labor theory of value. He always, when he spoke about his own project, he just spoke about value theory, but never about labor theory of value. And he was full of critique of the labor theory of value of Smith and Ricardo. He said that on the one hand, okay, they did some basic findings. They connected labor with value, but they never asked the question why labor takes the form of value. This was something they took for granted. But on this stick the whole commodity form. Why labor products take the form of commodities? This is not natural. We cannot take for granted. This is an expression of a very specific social structure, and this social structure as structure was not analyzed in classical theory. So Marx, this is one level of critique. The other level of critique is that he says they don't see the special character of the labor which constitutes value, especially they miss the connection between labor, value and money. And this is then his new, or one of his really new points, to give this connection between labor, value and money.
Yes, but as you claim, this Marx's new conception was not without ambiguity. So you have claimed that there are basically two discourses present in Marx's work, and one discourse points towards what you call a substantialist theory of value, and the other discourse points towards a different monetary theory of value. So could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Okay, before we already discussed the term scientific revolution, and I strongly maintain that Marx did a scientific revolution, and such a scientific revolution means a big break with the scientific field before. But also Marx was a human being with limited resources, limited thinkings, and you cannot imagine that the same guy is doing such a basic scientific revolution and then presents and extends this scientific revolution in the perfect way. He sticks, on the one hand, he breaks with his forerunners, but on the other hand, unconsciously, not fully knowing this, he sticks also to the field he did the break with. And this is for everybody who is occupied a little bit with the history of sciences. This is not at all an exception. For example, Galilei, the creator of modern physics, he also did a scientific revolution, a break with medieval physics, and nevertheless, in his writings, you can find a lot of traces of these medieval physics. And similar, I think, it is we have to tackle Marx, and that we have these two discourses also provoked certain problems which were discussed in Marxist debates, and because a lot of these discussants were not ready to say that even Marx can have an error, can do a mistake. They try to put together these two discourses, what is not possible. So now you mentioned one of the basic examples for these two discourses, the substantialist and non-substantialist theory of value. Marx, in his discourse which belongs to the scientific revolution, speaks of substance of value in a way that substance is a relation. He stresses in the first chapter of volume 1 of Capital that value substance is a common substance. When commodity A and commodity B are exchanged, then and only then they have something in common. So the value substance, value as substance, is not an attribute to a single commodity, it is a relation. And when you think the philosophical notion of substance as a relation, this is a kind of revolution with the Aristotelian tradition. Aristoteles, in his work on categories and also in his metaphysics, introduced the notion of substance in a very influential way, which prevailed Occidental thinking for 2000 years. Marx, who was a very good, he had very good knowledge in Aristotle. You can see even a reading of Aristotle in the footnotes of Capital. He breaks with this notion of substance as an attribute of a single thing, and substitutes it by a concept of substance as a relation. What I call substantialist, what we find in classical political economies and also in a lot of Marxist approaches of today, is a substantialist notion of value, which again restricts value to the attribute of a single commodity. For the single commodity, there are 10 hours of labor time necessary to produce it. These 10 hours of labor time constitute a certain value which is embedded in this commodity. From the conception, it is a pure Aristotelian idea of substance, a non-relational idea of substance. This I call substantialist, and this differs fundamentally from this relational concept of substance, which is based to Marx value theory.
The differences are not only present in terms of different conceptions of the substance, but also the importance that is contributed to the forms of appearance of this substance, namely the value form to a certain extent is basically absent in substantialist theory of value, but in your interpretation of Marx theory of value as a monetary theory of value, you treat it as a crucial part of Marx theory. So why basically is it crucial, and what are the main implications of Marx value form analysis?
Just before I give some arguments to the content of value form, some statistics about value form. When you read Marx Capital, chapter 1, about the commodity, this chapter 1 has 4 parts. What is the biggest part? It is the part on value form. What is the part which in most receptions is neglected? It is the part on value form. So the biggest part is neglected interpretations. When you hear this, you should have some doubts. How does this fit together? And when you go one step further, when you look to Marx manuscripts from Grundrisse, Critique of Political Economy, first part in 59, Theories of Surplus Value, Capital, first edition 67, second edition 72, which part was mostly changed, on which part Marx invested most of his time? The section on value form. So, only by this very superficial statistical data you can have an idea how important this value form analysis for Marx at least was. What is the content? What is the argument? Why it is so important? In a rather abstract way, I described substance as a relation, value substance in Marx as a relation and not as an isolated thing, as an attribute of an isolated thing. When substance of value is a relation, then it can only appear in a relation, then it cannot appear in a thing. And value form analysis is exactly the analysis of this necessary appearance, and this necessary appearance is at the same time the only way to catch this substance. You cannot have the substance, the content, without this form of appearance. The form of appearance is not just an addition like a bonus track on a CD. It is the only way to catch the content. and therefore it is so important. Now, I think I didn't answer what you already asked me before, this term monetary theory of value. This term is not used by Marx. It was coined by Hans-Georg Backhaus in the 70s to make a difference between what he called pre-monetary theory of values, the value theory of the classics, of the neoclassics, and of the main Marxists. They are pre-monetary theory of values. Why? They think they can tackle value without regarding value form and the money form as the highest expression of value form. Marx, he himself stressed explicitly the connection between labor and money. This was one of his main critiques against Ricardo, that Ricardo cannot understand this connection. Therefore, Backhaus used the term to show the specificity of Marx value theory. Backhaus used this term, it's a monetary theory of value. You can understand what value means only when you understand that for value it is necessary to have a monetary expression. The monetary expression is not just an addition. So, this new notion of substance as something relational, the necessity of value form analysis, form of appearance, necessary expression of the substance, and money as the key point, the pivot of value form analysis. These 3 points are connected to each other, and this then extending what Backhaus already started, this I stress now as the monetary theory of value we can find in Marx.
This new monetary theory of value also implies a different conception of the specific character of labor within capitalism. So this dual character of labor within capitalism was also often neglected by different substantialist theories of value. I mean, they made a distinction between concrete labor and abstract labor, but they treated these two concepts as as two concepts that aren't basically substantially diverging, that are not qualitatively different, because abstract labor as opposed to concrete labor was usually just understood as concrete labor in general, or concrete labor as such. So do you think this conception is correct, or do you have an alternative notion of this distinction between concrete and abstract labor?
The distinction is not only correct, it's absolutely basic. But as you already said, it was often misunderstood or neglected. Also here, it is very interesting to see Marx's self-perception and what a lot of readers made with this self-perception. Marx tackles the dual character of not of labor in general, but of commodity-producing labor, already in the first chapter of Capital. And there he makes the remark that Marx, was the first to discover this dual character, and that it is, in German he used the word Springpunkt, the decisive point is a weak translation for this Springpunkt, for the understanding of political economy. So Marx did here something what is very, very rare in his work. He applauded to himself. He said, I am the first who discovered this, and this is the decisive point. So by this you can learn how important this dual character was for Marx. But when you look in a lot of Marxist literature, you find shortly explained, yes, there is this distinction, concrete labor produces use value, abstract labor produces value. What is abstract labor? Abstract labor is labor in general, labor as such. Stop. Not anymore. If this would be the truth, Marx would be a big pretender to say, oh, I discovered the decisive point to understand so much. No, it is much more. Concrete labor, as Marx also stressed in Capital, is an eternal necessity for humans. We have to spend labor in order to survive in every society. Abstract labor is a certain social construction which exists only in commodity-producing societies. So abstract labor is nothing at all something natural, that work is hard, that we are sweating when we do hard work, that we are tired after hard work or so. This has nothing to do with abstract labor. Abstract labor is the way in which private labor becomes a part of social labor in a commodity-producing economy. So abstract labor plays only a role in commodity-producing economy, but there it plays a very decisive role. And this in most Marxist approaches is totally overseen. It is mentioned as if Marx did a small refinement to the classical notions. They speak of labor. He said, okay, concrete labor, abstract labor, but so on. Let's go on. Other points are much more interesting.
Yes, but you also claim that there is an ambivalence in Marx's concept,
yes,
in his treatment of abstract
yes,
labor.
you are right. This is the point I have to say something. Yes. Marx, on the one hand, stresses this pure social character of abstract labor, but he has problems to make it plausible for the reader. And there, in trying to make it plausible for the reader, he falls back in a kind of naturalism. You have in Capital, in the first chapter, you have a formulation, value-producing labor is labor in the physiological sense. And in another page, he wrote of labor just as spending your brain and your muscles. By this, you can really have the idea abstract labor means the abstract physiological side of every labor process. This, for example, is the way Robert Kurz, a very well-known German theoretician, understood abstract labor. You can find these two quotes in Marx which hint to such a naturalistic understanding of abstract labor, but you can find a lot of contradicting notions where Marx stressed the pure social character of abstract labor. So my interpretation is that also these naturalistic formulations of Marx is a rest, something which is left from the old field of economics, of classical economics, which Marx overcome, but some parts he just was glued with, and we have to to make a clear cut, to say, no, this physiological notion is pure nonsense. And when Marx argues like this, it's nonsense what he is writing. But when he speaks of abstract labor as a pure social thing, this is the discourse which is useful, which belongs to this new field of his scientific revolution.
So this naturalistic conception of abstract labor basically conceptualizes abstract labor in terms of mental abstraction of concrete labor, but your conception of abstract labor as social substance implies a different process of abstraction, a different praxis that makes labor abstract. So you've also used the term real abstraction to show how this labor in capitalism becomes abstract. So could you briefly explain what is real abstraction and how does it take place?
First, let's say a sentence to this mental abstraction. Mental abstraction means what we are usually doing when we abstract things. Let us say here I have two nice books. The one is Marx Capital, the other is my book. These two books have in common that they are books. And then you can say, what is a book? A book is a collection of pages, bound, and so on. So you have different things, and by thinking, you try to fix what is common in these different things, and this is then the abstract concept, maybe of a book or of different chairs, and so on. Real abstraction, by the way, a notion not coined by me, it was coined by Sohn Redl, also a very old, in the meantime, very well-known theoretician. With real abstraction is meant what happens in the social process, independently of the thoughts people have. When, and the exchange of commodities is a very nice example for this real abstraction. When you and me exchange commodities, let us say your nice mobile phone and my book, we exchange this. What then we do, no matter if we think about or not, we put an equality between the mobile and the book. We see something basically equal there, which allows us to exchange. So this equality between the mobile and the book is not a mental abstraction, it is an abstraction executed by practice. And this practice then structures our thinking, imposes certain structure on our thinking. This is meant with real abstraction, which is not the same as mental abstraction.
Okay, so if abstract labor is completely a social substance that takes place during the process of real abstraction, does this mean that abstract labor basically cannot be measured in terms of labor time?
First, to complete this real abstraction, abstract labor is not conceptualized by the persons doing the exchange. This is also a very common misunderstanding of value theory. Marx has not the idea that people exchange a mobile against a book because people think that the amount of labor here is the same than the amount of labor there. Maybe they have very different ideas. By the exchange, something is constituted in the mind and not the other way around. This abstract labor is a substance of value, is what is constituted in this commodity producing society in order to fix the social character of the privately spent labor. And this is not just to measure with a watch in your hand. What you can measure with a watch in your hand is the concrete labor time of a concrete worker. I can observe a carpenter producing a table, and I'm standing with my watch and can say, yes, this carpenter needed 10 hours for this table. This I can measure. But abstract labor is the recognition of this privately spent individual labor as a part of social labor. And this recognition has to be produced in an act of exchange. Maybe the laborer, it's impossible for the laborer to sell his table. Then he didn't produce a commodity and he didn't produce value. Nevertheless, he spent 10 hours of labor time. Or the carpenter comes to the market and has to recognize that all the other carpenters use a lot of advanced machinery and they can produce the table in 2 hours and he needed 10 hours. Then his 10 hours are not fully recognized. Or maybe he used the same advanced machinery and at the market he has to recognize that all the carpenters produced so much tables which are not needed in the society. Then also his real spent labor time is not acknowledged as a part of social labor. Abstract labor means what is acknowledged of a part as social labor, of social labor time, and this what is acknowledged you cannot measure in hours, in labor time. You cannot measure with a watch. The only way to measure this is money, and therefore we find the very nice sentence in this small book of Marx, Critique of Political Economy, part 1 from 1859, 8 years before volume 1 of Capital, where he writes that money is the immediate form of existence of abstract labor, unmittelbare Existenzform. In Capital, in chapter 3, he at least very shortly stresses that value has this immanent measure of labor time, but you cannot use it. You need money. This is the first page of chapter 3 in volume 1 of Capital. This is, by the way, another aspect of this monetary theory of value.
So according to your view, there is no way to determine the magnitude of value in labor time without the mediation of money, without
not
interference of price, basically. No,
not at all. People who do this, they speak not of a market economy. They speak, and this is a very nice example. It's there are approaches where people try just from the conditions of production to count what is the labor content of value. This means from the market economy they exclude the market. It is like neoclassical economics. They do in some respect the same. I don't know if there are some students of economics and you heard of Walrasian auctionator. It is the same idea. I describe a market economy without the market, by excluding the market. And this shows that as well neoclassical economists, like such Marxists, didn't understand the specificity of a market economy. But this was the point of Marx. He wanted to understand this. And this you can only understand with the use of money. When you exclude money from the theory, you have no chance to understand it.
Okay, and some authors, some critiques of your work, namely Paul Cockshott, has claimed that your conception of abstract labor as an unquantifiable in terms of labor time makes your conception of abstract labor equivalent to like a spiritual force, and makes your theory of value a scientifically untestable theory. So how would you answer to such critiques?
It's a very nice article he wrote. He named it New Age Marxism. That what I'm arguing is spiritualistic because it is you cannot fix it, you cannot measure it. When you cannot measure it really, then it has not a material reality, it is a kind of spiritual concept. This idea that you have to measure it, or better, it's possible that you can touch it, is an idea of the natural science-inspired materialism of 19th century. There we can already find this. There are famous names, Büchner, Moleschott, Vogt. Marx knew this guy, and he made already his jokes about this narrow-minded understanding of Marxism. At least in 19th century, this kind of, not Marxism, of materialism, this kind of materialism found some confirmation in the physics of these times. When we look to the physics of our times, or if Paul Cockshott would do this, I fear he would suffer by a heart attack, especially when you are occupied with quantum physics. You have permanently physical magnitudes which you cannot measure, where you only can find some effects. When you measure the exact position of an elementary particle like an electron, when you measure this, it is not there before. The measurement, in some respect, create the position of this electron. So, for what he blames me, when this is New Age, spiritual, non-scientific, then I think I'm in a very good company with modern physics. And when this is the main accusation, I can live rather good with it.
Okay, another often criticized aspect of your work was that basically, since you claim that value is only present in exchange, and that abstract labor only comes about in the process of exchange, you were accused of being a circulationist, namely that your theory basically departs from Marxian notion that value is created solely within the process of production. So, and how do you answer such critiques?
In this introduction, I devote a whole subchapter to this question. I think already the question is a nice example of a question mal posée, a question which asks, where does value emerge? In the production sphere or in the circulation sphere? Such a question you can only formulate when you have this old Aristotelian notion of substance in mind, that substance is like a thing, like the ink on the paper, which is then an attribute of the single paper, but not a relation. Then you can put the question, where does the substance emerge, either from production or from circulation? The point for Marx is that the substance is a relation which expresses the relation between production and circulation. So the value emerges neither in production nor in circulation. It expresses a certain interference, a certain relation between these two. The only point where we can find the value, where we can measure value by money, this is the exchange process, the circulation process. But it is a difference if I say value is produced in circulation. This proposition is totally wrong. Or if you say the circulation is the only sphere where value exists. This proposition, I think, is correct. To produce something or that something exists in a certain sphere is not the same. And therefore, I would refuse this, that I'm blamed as a circulationist. You see, I even have problems to pronounce the word. I think it is the view of persons who have this productionist bias, who want to understand a market economy not by the market but only by the production. And when someone comes and says, yes, but the production is not enough to understand, they say, oh, this is a circulation theory. No, they have a pure production theory, and I at least have the claim that I have a theory which focuses on the interference between production and circulation.
This reminds me of Isaac Illich Rubin, by whom you were probably influenced a bit, yes, who also basically claimed that value only becomes actual in exchange and that abstract labor only becomes present in the process of exchange. However, he introduced two different conceptions of exchange. He distinguished between exchange as a social form of the whole reproduction process on the one hand, and exchange as a particular specific phase within this process of reproduction that alternates from the process of direct production. So when he was accused, of being a circulationist, he stressed that when he says that value only and abstract labor only come about in exchange, he basically said that he has this first concept of exchange in mind, namely exchange as a form of the whole reproduction process. So what about you? What is your point?
First, a word to Rubin. Rubin was a very important thinker, and when you read contemporaries of Rubin in the 1920s, Rubin, I would say, he was very much advanced to the discussions of his time. Therefore, I regret a lot that I didn't explicitly mention Rubin in this work, because it is an introduction. I wanted to give a lot of history of the development of theory, and I restricted the quotations of other theoreticians. In my other book, Science of Value, I of course mention Rubin and estimate his work. So you are right, I learned a lot from Rubin, this is true. Also, I have some critique of Rubin, and the point you mentioned is one of the points of my critique. Here, I think he conceded too much to this productionist critics, because I would say in both notions of circulation as the general form of reproduction, but also circulation or exchange as the concrete exchange, it plays both the same role. Only in the exchange process we can speak of value. Marx stresses this also in the first chapter of Capital, where he writes in the subchapter on commodity fetishism, where he writes that only in exchange the use values get the value objectivity. Before this value objectivity kommt in Betracht is the German formulation. It plays a role in mind of the producers. They doesn't produce just something. They have ideas about values, but this value is in the mind and not really existing. Existing, it is only in exchange. So I would say, and this is a difference to Rubin in this point, that value exists only in the exchange, holds for both notions of exchange you mentioned. And this is a real important point. You can find this explicitly in this subchapter on commodity fetishism, and also much more extensively, Marx deals this point in his so-called reworking manuscript, when he reworked the first edition of Capital from 67 to the second edition of 72. There you can find a very interesting kind of self-commentary of Marx. He argues, okay, when you read my presentation of value, you can have this and this idea, but this is not meant. We have not isolated value. Before exchange, we have not even commodity. We have use values. So this, what I am blamed for as a circulationist theory of value, you can find merely literally in this reworking manuscript, which was published in the 80s in the Mega, which nowadays is not translated. In another book I quote the decisive, here also I quote something from this manuscript in this book. A bigger part I quote in another book, which is also translated in some languages. But Marx's manuscript itself, unfortunately, is not translated. But there you can find the answer to this question very clearly.
Okay, since the time is running rather fast, we have to go to the third last part of the interview. So we will discuss some Marxist theories of crisis. So even though Marx regularly spoke of capitalist crisis and showed where the capitalist system implies or indicates possibilities of crisis, he never really systematically developed a fully coherent theory of crisis. Yet various Marxist authors have deduced from his theory at least 5 different variations or variants of such a theory.
Only 5?
Only, oh, there are more of them, but I will talk only of 5 of them. So the first one is the theory of underconsumption. So the basic idea is that, of course, capitalists in their struggle to increase the rate of surplus value tend to decrease wages, which in turn causes a lack of aggregate demand and eventually leads to crisis. So this is roughly the point. So do you think this theory holds water, and does it have any support in Marx's work?
There is some support. There is one very famous quote from the manuscript of volume 3, where Marx says the less consumption of the masses is the last reason for crisis. But you found already a rather striking critique of underconsumption theory in Grundrisse, where Marx blamed Proudhon for having such a theory, and he said it is nonsense. The workers with the wages never can buy the whole product. If this would be possible, there would be no profit. Only because the laborers receive less than the value of the product, there we have the possibility of profit. So a pure underconsumptionist theory of crisis is not cannot explain anything, but maybe a dynamic of underconsumption in certain situations can explain something, but it is not the basis of a crisis theory.
And what about the other theory that's usually referred to as the profit squeeze theory? Basically, it is based on a notion that accelerated capital accumulation basically increases the demand for labor power, which in turn pushes wages up and eventually leads to a fall in the rate of profit and consequently to crisis. So what about this theory?
It's very nice that you took this as the second example, because it is just the opposite of this underconsumption theory. Underconsumption says, oh, the wages are too low, this provokes crisis. The profit squeeze theory says, oh, the wages are too high, this provokes crisis. And this, also for this you can have some hints in Marx. It is not a basic theory of crisis. Already what you mentioned from volume 1 is a part of the economic cycle, and this means it is a part on what Marx is not focusing in Capital. When we discuss about Capital, we always have to be conscious what was the object of Capital, what Marx wanted to analyze. He described this at the end of volume 3 as the ideal average of the inner organization of the capitalist mode of production. So, in the 3 volumes of Capital, Marx didn't want to analyze a certain capitalist economy or a certain period of capitalist development. He wanted to analyze very basic structures of capital, and the economic cycle didn't belong to this. It is explicitly excluded from this ideal average. So, when we speak about profit squeeze, we change the level of abstraction. It is not anymore the level of abstraction on what the analysis in Capital takes place. In reality, there are some periods, some countries where people argue, for example, in Great Britain after World War II, that there was something like a profit squeeze. So it may happen empirically, but it is not the motor of capitalist crisis.
So what about the third variant that usually follows Marx's depiction of the schemes of reproduction in Capital Volume 2 and makes a case for a crisis as a result of the disproportionality between the Department 1 that produces the means of production and the Department 2 that produces the means of consumption? So.
This can happen, such disproportionality not only can happen, it happens always. And this is, by the way, one of the less forms of crisis which are also tackled by mainstream economists, by classical and neoclassical economists, that even such guys who say capitalist economy is an economy without crisis, they admit that there can be an imbalance between different sectors, and then we have a crisis which provokes an adjustment process. So this can happen, but again, this is not the basic process of a capitalist crisis. This is an adjustment process which happens every day.
And some other authors have also suggested that there is a theory of collapse at work in Marx's work. One of them is Robert Kurz, who is often subject of your critique, and he basically developed a theory, or he claimed that Marx developed a theory in Grundrisse of irreconcilable contradiction of capital that basically strives to reduce the necessary labor time to a minimum, but at the same time poses the labor time as the sole measure of value. So this supposedly leads to an undermining of capital's own condition and to eventual collapse. So do you think that can we deduce such a theory from Marx's work, from Grundrisse, or from any other work?
Such theories of collapse are rather old. We can find them also in the old German Social Democratic Party before World War I. The idea capitalism will have crisis, it will collapse by this crisis. For some of these social democrats, this was the reason to be very cautious with revolutionary actions, because capitalism will collapse by itself. Why take a risk today? Capitalism will do the job alone, and then we will come. For others, like Rosa Luxemburg, who also had a kind of collapse theory, it was just the opposite. She argued the collapse will bring such brutal, violent forms of bestiality. We have to be quicker. We have to do the revolution before the collapse will arrive, in order to avoid all these bestialities. So you already had the notion of collapse and the very different political consequences which were drawn from such collapse theory in the early 90s. Robert Kurz and his group made this old theory again well known. Also, they stated now they found the real collapse theory, and they used mainly Grundrisse. And here indeed we can find a theory of collapse. At least you already sketched the main argument. Productivity brings to the situation that the labor content of each commodity is reduced, so value which is based on commodity is not longer feasible. There will be a collapse. Marx says this in Grundrisse, but later never he comes back to these considerations. When we look to Grundrisse, it is an extreme fascinating text, and I can recommend to read this text, but we have to have in mind it is a pre-major text. We should first read Capital and then Grundrisse, and not Grundrisse and then Capital. Why? When Marx started with writing Grundrisse, he had not really his own value theory. He started at once with money, used some elements of Ricardian value theory, but he had no idea about the twofold character of commodity producing labor. He had not a notion of abstract labor, and so on. In an article which last year appeared, I showed in detail how this theoretical lapse in Grundrisse provoked this misconception of a collapse theory. It had some theoretical reasons, but also it had some political reasons. In 1948, there was in a lot of European countries revolution, which were defeated, as we all know, and Marx asked himself what were the reasons for this revolution. And before the revolution was a strong economic crisis. He had the idea that economic crisis, provoke revolutions. And the whole 50s, 1850s, when he was in exile in London, living under very poor personal conditions, he waited for the next crisis because he expected revolution, and he studied, this was the reason for his extensive study of economy, to find out what are the mechanisms of crisis when the next crisis will come. And with this expectation, crisis provokes revolution, he also developed the idea crisis will shake capitalism so strongly that it will break down. So this was the whole mixture, a political background, a historical background, a lack in theoretical notions, which give reason to this misconception in Grundrisse. Then the crisis came in 57, 58. It's very funny to read Marx's letters of his time. He says, oh, now I'm working day and night on my book so that it is ready before revolution comes, because after revolution nobody would be interested in these things. But probably I'm too late. The last 15 years are wasted. I will not be ready before revolution and breakdown will come. As we know, he was half right. He was not ready with his book, but there was no revolution. The crisis went over very quickly, and after this crisis, capitalism as a system was much, much stronger than before. And so by this crisis, 57, 58, by the way, it was the first crisis we can really call a world economic crisis, because all leading capitalist nations were involved. And what Marx learned from this crisis is that the crisis has, on the one hand, an enormous destructive capacity. It provokes unemployment. It destroys the living perspectives for millions of workers. It destroys a lot of companies. They go bankruptcy. But capitalism as a system becomes stronger through a crisis. And after this encounter, you will not find any notion of collapse in Marx. It's very funny to read his letters 20 or 25 years after this crisis of 57. In the 1870s, Marx was pressed to complete Capital. Only volume 1 had appeared. And so in the year 1878, he wrote to the Russian translator, Danielson, who asked when finally will come volume 2 and 3 of Capital. He asked, oh, in the moment we have a very interesting crisis which shows very new phenomena. I cannot finish my work before this crisis will come to its peak, because I have to consume the crisis theoretically. So, no fear that the crisis will provoke revolution, that the crisis will provoke a collapse. The crisis is an interesting study object to understand the motion, the movement of capital. So Marx completely abolished this idea of collapse, which, this is true, we can find in Grundrisse.
Okay, so let us just address the last, the fifth variant of the theory of crisis, probably the most notorious and controversial one, the falling rate of profit, of course deduced from Marx's depiction of the law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in Capital Volume 3. So this theory basically claims roughly that increased accelerated accumulation of capital by means of introduction of labor-saving technologies brings about rising organic composition of capital and consequently leads to a falling rate of profit and eventually causes crisis. So do you think that such theory holds water?
No. A lot of you look very tired and bored, so I could make the thing very short and just say no. Next question. But perhaps I will give some reason for my no. Because in this construction, the law of the profit rate to fall as a cause for crisis theory, there is not only one error inside, there are more than one error inside. The first error, in some respect, is provoked by Engels, who edited Capital, the third volume of Capital, and who also gave to this what we now know as chapter 15 about the consequences of the inner contradictions of the law of the profit rate, which covers a lot of considerations about crisis by Marx. To this chapter, Engels coined the title, he reordered this chapter, and the reader can have the idea that Marx tried to give crisis theory as a consequence of the law of the profit rate to fall. When you look in the original manuscript, which now since 20 years is published in this new Marx-Engels Gesamtausgabe, you can have a quite different impression. Marx focused on his law of the profit rate to fall, and at the end of the chapter, without title, without order, there are some ideas about crisis, like we find also in other chapters, that the beginning of the chapter has a strict structure, and at the end of the chapter he had a lot of things in mind which were noted for later use, but not necessarily used at this point as a consequence of what was written before. So the first problem is that the addition of Engels insinuated a strong connection between the profit rate law and the crisis theory, which is not at all in Marx's original writing. Second point regarding this. When we accept the law of the profit rate, of a tendency of the profit rate to fall, this as such cannot provoke any crisis. Because this law is settled on a very high level of abstraction, just that there is a tendency to fall. Now imagine when, for example, the profit rate in Europe falls during 100 years from 12% to 11%. This fall will provoke no crisis. It will not even recognize. Only the persons who do statistics will recognize that there is a fall. So that the profit rate fall can provoke a crisis. The fall as such is not enough. There must be a very quick, a very sudden fall. But this is not maintained by this law. What is maintained by this law is a long-lasting tendency to fall. and this has nothing to do with a crisis tendency. So, from the content, the idea to base a crisis theory on this law is wrong. And the third point, unfortunately, this law Marx tried to give reason in Capital is wrong. There are very simple counter arguments against this proposition Marx did. And in this article in Monthly Review last year appeared, I try to follow some hints that Marx in the 1870s also recognized this by himself. The text, when we speak about the profit law and the tendency to fall, we refer to a manuscript which was written in the year 1865. 1865, Marx worked another 15 years on critique of political economy, not explicitly to this law of the profit rate, but to other attributes of profit rate. And there is a big manuscript written 10 years later, in the year 75. He did a lot of accountings of the profit rate, and he has to realize, with the assumptions of the manuscript from 65, the profit rate sometimes falls, but very often it doesn't fall. So it is not at all so clear that it will fall. There is also a footnote, or now it is a footnote. It was a remark in his own copy of Capital. By hand, he wrote something what Engels later, in the later editions, included as a footnote. And what is said in this footnote is that a capital with a higher organic composition has also a higher profit rate. It is just the opposite from this profit rate law he proposed before. But okay, it is an isolated remark, handwritten in his reading copy of Capital 1. But what I think is very convincing, for me at least, that when you read the letters of Marx from the 1870s, crisis is very often an issue. But nowhere in these letters, or also not in other manuscripts, Marx says something about the connection between profit rate law and crisis. He also not mentions this profit rate law. So, for Marx, obviously, it was not so important. It was not a moment to explain anything regarding crisis. Maybe he had forgotten it. Some person will say who wants to maintain this law. I think he had really doubts about this law, and he never saw, first he never saw it as a moment to explain crisis, and secondly, in the 1870s, he had doubts about this law, and therefore it never appeared. So, this is the reason for my no to your question before.
Okay. I'll accept that, and we'll have to basically finish, so I'll just pose one last question. You mentioned your monthly review article where you put forth this critique of Marx's law, tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but you've also sketched an alternative theory of crisis, at least briefly. So could you basically depict this sketch of your conception of crisis, of theory of crisis?
Before, I already mentioned that when we speak about Marx Capital, we have to be clear about the level of abstraction on which Marx is arguing. And he argues on this very high level of abstraction, ideal average of capitalist mode of production. On this level, we can find, I think, some very basic ideas about the mechanism of crisis. Very quickly abbreviated, the basic idea is that the profit-seeking process, that capital always not only wants to get profit, but wants to increase profit, wants to have the maximum of profit, provokes, on the one hand, an extension of production. To have more profit, you need to produce more to have bigger markets so that you have bigger returns to capital. And on the other hand, to diminish the costs of this production, to diminish not only wages, but only to diminish costs for energy, for raw material, for machinery, and so on. So you have on the one hand a tendency to extend production, to extend the supply in modern terms, but on the other hand, the tendency to reduce costs. But what is cost for the one side is demand for the other side. When I reduce the wages of the laborers, I reduce costs, but also I reduce the demand of the laborers. When I reduce costs for energy, I reduce my costs, but also I diminish the demand for energy. So you have the tendency of growing supply, diminishing demand. And this results in a gap. And this gap, after a while, provokes a crisis. This is the most basic mechanism of crisis, analyzed very briefly in this chapter 15 of volume 3. But Marx didn't stop with this. He knows very well that capital cannot stand without money and credit, and he analyzed also the credit system. This analysis is very incomplete. When we read volume 3 of Capital, we have the analysis given in the year 65. In the 70s, Marx made big progress on this field. He wanted to alter completely the section on interest and crisis. He wanted even to change the empirical reference point. It should not be anymore England for this section, it should be the United States, because he realized that in the 1870s there was such a quick development in United States, and the development driven by the credit system in United States, that his idea was, I have to make this the empirical basis for my analysis and not longer the system in Great Britain. And then, in the crisis 78, Marx get aware that he cannot analyze anymore the credit system isolated as credit system. He must analyze the international relation between financial markets. He has to analyze the role of the national banks, and then we are confronted with the role of the state in economics. All this we cannot find, or find only rudimentary, in the analysis of 65, which constitutes the main part of volume 3 of Capital. Insofar, my answer to your question is, we can identify one basic mechanism of crisis on a very, very high level of abstraction, and we can identify certain ideas, but not something fully developed about credit system, financial system, the relation between financial system and the manufacturing companies and so on. Here Marx really was in the middle of the process and couldn't finish. Before I mentioned this letter where Marx mentioned I have to wait for the peak of the crisis in order to consume it theoretically. This means he was very clear that he was not ready with his analysis. Capital, the book Capital, is not only incomplete because Marx didn't find the time to formulate the last chapters, to do the last corrections. This would be a quantitative incompleteness. It is incomplete in a qualitative sense that in some very important fields the analysis is not ready. It is just, Marx is just it is just a work in progress. And when we want to work with Capital, and I can only recommend this, it is the best what we have. When we want to work with Capital, then we must also be aware of such limits of Capital and not overestimate what tool we have, but nevertheless also only overestimating it. It is a brilliant tool, and so I can only recommend to all of us, let's read Capital. You have here this new translation of Capital, and it's a hard book to read. You have a nice introduction in Capital.
Okay, I think that's a nice way to finish the interview. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have much time, so we have to end this discussion, but nevertheless we have a little bit of time left for some questions for the public. So should anyone have any questions or comments for Michael, please? Yes.
You mentioned fetishism briefly when talking about Marxist break with criticism. Considering that Marx in his early works talks about the concept of ideology and then stops it, sometimes in the later works switches to concepts of mystification, fetishism and so on, would you consider also a theory of fetishism as a break with earlier theory of ideology, or do you think they belong to separate theoretical projects?
I wouldn't say it's a break with a theory of ideology. It is a different approach. You find a theory of ideology, for example, in this work, German Ideology, which is not a title formulated by Marx. But you don't find a theory of fetishism. In Communist Manifesto, you find a theory of anti-fetishism. In some respect, you can say Marx argues, as he is a little Max Weber, that in the development of modern society, the social relations become more and more clear. The medieval relations were mystified by religion, by honor and such concepts, but in modern capitalist society, the social relations are very clear. So, in Communist Manifesto, it's the absolute absence of fetishism and mystification. This Marx learns in the 50s and 60s, and this notion of fetishism becomes more and more important. In Capital, for example, you find the word ideology just in 2 or 3 pages in a not very important context. But fetishism is a very important concept. So I wouldn't say it is a break, it is a difference in the point what is important for Marx.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, perhaps I'll follow up on this question. Are we really talking about the same thing when we say fetishism and ideology? Because as I understand, fetishism, this is an objective fact. We must behave in a certain way when entering social relations, regardless of whether we know it or not. And ideology, on the other hand, is a subjective perception.
Of course we don't talk about the same object, but you can also not say it is a break, because also with the background of capital, a theory of ideology makes sense. But it is something else than fetishism, and fetishism is more basic, more fundamental. What you just mentioned, it is an objective reversal. It structures our mind. On the basis of fetishism, then different ideologies are possible. So it is a theory of ideology makes sense, but only when it is based somewhere. And what I would criticize, for example, with writers like Gramsci, or also Althusser, who wrote about ideological state apparatus, that they try to construct a theory of ideology without such, that they are rooted in a theory of fetishism.
Anyone else?
Can I ask you, since you mentioned Robert Kurz, can you mention something on the background of a remark he makes in his work, Geld ohne Wert, where he tries to emphasize that the Neue Marx-Lektüre, and you in particular, are caught up in some kind of postmodern ideology of Zeichen und Bezeichnet. And what does he mean? Is it like his work is aiming at Geld als Wertträger, or something like that, or is it this substantial, non-substantialist?
In this book, he interprets me or my approach as a kind of post-structuralist approach. This is a big point. In some, I have to accentuate some respect. In some respect, I think we can learn from post-structuralist approaches, and so it is not completely wrong what he writes. I would pose it in different ways, of course. He means it as a very strong critic, and it is really a pity. Kurz died before this book appeared, and a few months before he died, we had a meeting. There was a discussion which then appeared in the Journal Konkret in Germany, and he told me about this book, and we already talked about, yes, very nice, and when the book will have appeared, then we will make a big discussion about this. And okay, unfortunately he died, and it is not possible. I think in this book, nevertheless, that he did very sharp criticism against me, it would provide us with a good basis for discussion, where we really could make a difference. Some points I would say, okay, you misinterpret me, what you say about me is wrong. But other points, I would say, okay, maybe it's not totally wrong what you write about me, but it's not so bad what I'm doing as the way you estimate this. So I think it would have been a very interesting and for both of us productive discussion. nevertheless, we wouldn't agree. This I'm sure, but it would be very productive, and so it's very, very sad that he died so unexpectedly.
You mentioned that the existence of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall does not necessarily lead to a start of a crisis. From 12% to 11% is not going to end capitalism. Now, Andrew Kleiman, who, as you know, has rallied his troops and published quite an extensive reply to your monthly review article, had a direct reply to this. Now, to skip all the mental abstraction, as you said before, he made a comparison to the theory of gravity. Just because the apple does not fall from the tree, it does not mean that there's not a force at work. And of course, he claims that in this example, this force that is at work is the change in the organic composition of capital. I mean, what is the reply?
I will reply. There were to this monthly review article, there were several replies. Some were directed directly to monthly review. This I already answered. And now I also will write an article as an answer to this Kleiman and others article. I think he misunderstands also very much the theory of gravity in this respect. Because first, what you first said with the 12% or 11% is another field. When in a long run the profit rate falls very modest, nobody recognizes this. Also Kleiman cannot recognize this, and this will provoke nothing. So when you want to have a theory of crisis based on the profit rate, you must have an additional argument that the profit rate fall is very quick. I don't see the arguments for this, the theoretical arguments. With the gravity thing, it is, I think he misunderstands here something. You have a pure theory of gravity. You can follow this on the moon. There is no air between the apple and the moon. And then the law of gravity, what Newton formulated, exactly determines what the apple will do if we would have an apple tree on the moon, or let us say a spaceship on the moon and something falls down. The apple would exactly follow to the law of gravity. And my critique to the law of the profit rate formulated by Marx is not on the level there are counteracting forces and now it doesn't happen. No, I argue on the pure theory, on the basic level. So when you want to have the comparison to the gravity law, when I would try to criticize Newton in a similar way like Marx, I would have to say his formula for the law of gravity is wrong. This is so, Kleiman misses the point where my critique starts. He has the idea it starts at another point, and then he can easily say, oh, this critique doesn't hold. No, my critique starts at a different point. But this now may sound very abstract, very hard to understand if you don't know the articles. I hope in the next 2-3 months I will find the time to publish an answer to this article where I can give my arguments in a more extended way like it is possible now.
Any more questions? I guess I can one last question. You said that basically the falling rate of profit, you cannot deduce the theory of crisis from the fact of the falling rate of profit. You have to have an additional argument. But there are authors who suggest such an additional argument. One of them is, for example, Michael Roberts, who has also written one critique of your work. And
I answered.
Yeah. But this was about the law, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. But this was about the theory of crisis, when he says that should the rate of profit basically result in the fall of the mass of profits, then this should result. Then this would result in a crisis. So what about?
Yeah, but it is again a question of velocity. When this mass of profit diminishes slowly, so that we have problems to recognize it by our statistical methods, then it's not my task. Then I want to hear from Michael Roberts or others the reason why this modest process causes crisis. When such a process should cause a crisis, it must be a sharp and sudden fall. Where is the argument? I never heard something about this. So I think all this is insufficient. And then we also have to think, when we talk about this law of Marx, Marx formulates this as a general law. That something can happen tomorrow, I don't deny. But when we speak of general laws, then it is meant that there is a necessity that this will happen again and again, and not that sometimes something will happen. And therefore also all the empirical arguments this line of authors use, I think they cannot convince when the question is, can we formulate a general law? The pure empirical argument that something happened in the past, then I suppose it will happen in the future, this can be very wrong. Some chickens had to learn this, that the man who feed them all the weeks before, one day comes to kill the chicken. So what happened in the past is not a security that the same will happen in the future. And therefore, all what they bring as theoretical arguments, as empirical arguments, I think these arguments are not very convincing.